Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. I am so thankful to God that He brought you here to me today. And I am so thankful to God that He brought me to you today. We must combat the seeds of fascism. We must combat the seeds of fascism. And there is only one way. We must unite in terms of love, unity, brotherhood, freedom, sisterhood. We must unite as one. It is the only way to combat the seeds that have been sowed of fascism. I look at my country of birth. I look at the United States of America. I look at the Western world that is dealing with the bouts of fascism, and people do not want to hear it. But the solution is only that we must love our enemy. You look at, for instance, very recently, the Supreme Court of the United States of America overturned affirmative action. And for many people, they don't understand why affirmative action is so important and actually making America a meritocracy. Many people who have been driven by rhetoric of propaganda say that affirmative action must be eviscerated because America should be a meritocracy. But to loosely quote the words of Nelson Mandela, affirmative action is important because it redresses, and I believe those were the exact words that he used, that exact word, redresses, not addresses, but redresses the fruits of war, slavery, colonialism, and sexism. Affirmative action is there because America has never been a meritocracy. Fascism is at the root of the DNA of the Western world, at the DNA of America. And if you look, this seed of fascism gets sowed very subtly. Oftentimes, people who have a paler skin color in this day and age, at this time, will hear people from marginalized groups such as Black people or people of color or people who are from the LGBTQ movement or people who are disabled. They may hear these people talk about race. They may hear these people say that white people have always wanted to eviscerate Black people off the planet. They may say that old white men have always had an issue with transgender people. They may say that white men hate to see a woman of color in power. And these people with paler skin, white people, may see this and they may have something triggered in them that says, hey, I don't want to talk about race. This makes me uncomfortable. This makes me fearful. This makes me angry. America is a meritocracy. I have been taught that individualism prevails in America. And if we each are individuals and we each strive to access goals, we will get them no matter the color of our skin. And unbeknownst to those people, oftentimes poor whites, what they don't understand is, for us to get to that place of America actually being a meritocracy, a place where race no longer has to come into the equation, we must talk about race. We must talk about the roots of hate, of fascism, of slavery, of colonialism, of racism. We must talk about these things to get to the next level. And what people often don't understand about fascism is that the seeds of fascism are often planted over time. They're planted insidiously, subtly. And at one point, a person who is from that majority group may say, he may have a discussion with a person from a marginalized group or a minority group, and that person from that marginalized or minority group will say, this person or these people from this majority group have always tried to persecute my people from this minority or marginalized group. But, and when they get to the but part, the person from that majority group will usually interrupt them, and they will say, yeah, but I kind of understand where the people from that majority group that you say have persecuted your group. I can understand where they're coming from. And little to the knowledge of that person from the majority group who cuts off that person from the marginalized group, the minority group, who keeps them from sharing their perspective and enriching their understanding of one another. As a result, they fail to understand that their inclination to cut them off, cut that marginalized or minority group person off, is a result of the seeds of fascism, which is a part of the roots of everything that America is. We're gonna come back to that, and I'm gonna break this down more. It's going to be very clear for you to understand. But if that person from that majority perspective would have let that person from that minority or marginalized group, they would have finished by saying, this majority group has always persecuted this minority or marginalized group that I come from, but with education, love, unity, sisterhood, brotherhood, peace, we can accomplish a better world together. But we never actually get to that point, because that person who has been sowed by the seeds of fascism gets automatically triggered and stopped at the terms like white or black or Latino or Asian or transgender or homosexual or disabled or veteran. And so the conversation never actually goes where it needs to go. And yes, there is only one race, the human race. But as Nelson Mandela said, we have to accept that racism is here today because of colonialism, war, slavery, sexism. It is a human construct. It was colonialism. Hundreds of years of chattel slavery that created the concept of the races to begin with. It is the DNA of slavery that is ingrained way further beyond in history, going deeper, far deeper in history, past chattel slavery, to the days of the Vikings, to the days of the Crusades, that one majority group started to say, I am better than this minority group. So until we actually truly address the seeds of fascism that is ingrained not only in American society, but in Western society in general, we cannot get over to that place where we all can love our enemies, where we all can turn our cheek as one nation under God. So I'm going to break this down for you a little bit, and it's not going to be what you want to hear, but it's going to be what is necessary. You see, in Germany, in Western Germany, after the 1940s, and again throughout the years, over the decades, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, Germany has made a considerable and continued effort to continue to combat fascism. Why? Because Germany knows it will never, ever go away fully. It is fully ingrained in the DNA of Western civilization. Germany understands that. So they pour money into education, into de-radicalizing. The government pours money, quite literally money, into de-radicalizing fascist, into de-radicalizing fascist institutions, individuals, and platforms. And I do have to emphasize the word de-radicalizing, because do not get it wrong, fascism is insidious and subtle. It works over time. It plants the seeds of racism, of fascism, of sexism, of misogyny. But it is a seed, and that seed grows and grows and grows until it is bigger than you ever understood how it got there, because it is deeply systemic. And it must be approached as if it needs to be uprooted completely. It's a very, very serious matter. And in the United States of America, I think for people of color, people like myself, people who come from ancestors of marginalized groups, and more ancestors who have been persecuted for centuries and centuries and centuries because of something as simple as the color of their skin, fascism is not very surprising. But we make strides forward. We make strides forward in society with help of people across all socioeconomic classes, all races, all colors, who advocate that whoever you are, whatever your skin color, whatever your socioeconomic class, you deserve to be healthy. You deserve to get affordable education. You deserve to be safe. But you go back, and somewhere along the lines, people of color, particularly Black people and people of color in the United States, got comfortable. They got silent. And it happens over and over again. At some point, we have to recognize the pattern. In the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement. And it was brutal, and it was difficult, and it was violent, and it was uncomfortable. And then we got to the 1970s, and there was more unity, and there was more diversity, and there was more sisterhood, and there was more brotherhood amongst all people of all races, of all socioeconomic classes, amongst Latinos and Blacks and whites and Asians. And then we got to the 1980s, and the war on drugs started to happen, and the police, the racially charged police brutality happened, and we saw a resurgence of the Black Power movement of the 1960s to the 1980s. And then we saw a renaissance in the 1990s that brought about innovation and diversity and representation of those marginalized and minority groups. And we thought that we had gotten to a good place. And then finally, we got to the early 2000s. And we had to displace this anger that was building from those seeds of fascism somewhere. And so we started wars. And then we got President Obama. We got the first Black president that the United States had ever had. And again, more progress had started to happen. More tolerance started to happen. More equality started to happen. The wage gap, the wealth gap started to close more. Representation started to happen more. And what happened? We entered back into these seeds of fascism, and now in 2023, we look at our country and it seems unrecognizable, and yet so recognizable at the same time. And we continue to ask ourselves these questions. How did we get here? How did we get here? But we know the answers to these questions. Fascism, as we said, is deeply, deeply rooted in everything that we do. And people from minority groups, people from marginalized groups are going to listen to this and they're not going to like it. But you know what we have to do. We must love our enemies. As we ask our enemies to love us, we must love our enemies. And that to explain how we get to that point, we have to take a look at how fascism works. So it starts with someone saying that what we said, The person from the minority or marginalized group says, I feel like this majority group has persecuted my minority group because of this, but and they get caught off there. They're not able to finish, but I feel with unity and sisterhood and brotherhood and peace and compassion and freedom and democracy, we can work towards a better future together. They get cut off. And the person from that majority group says, but I feel like those people, those majority groups are justified in what they did because blase, blase, blase. That's how it starts. That is the seed of fascism that has been sowed for years and decades and centuries and millennia. And then 5 or 10 years down the road, that person from that majority group will say, hey, every time I look around in society, the people who are doing the crazy, violent, aggressive, criminal stuff is this person from this marginalized minority group. And then 20 years down the line, that person from that majority group is out in the street intimidating people from minority and marginalized groups. They are out in the street protesting representation and wealth and equality for those minority and marginalized groups, to come back to the overturning of affirmative action and what Nelson Mandela said. Affirmative action is so important because it redresses the seeds of slavery, of colonization, of war, of sexism. Fascism will have you to believe that America is a meritocracy. And that is why enemies like affirmative action need to be eviscerated, because this is prejudice. This is prejudice against the majority group that has been there, and this is prejudice against them. It is giving that marginalized or minority group an unfair leg up. You cannot combat discrimination with more discrimination, but unbeknownst to these individuals and these platforms and these institutions that have been sowed with the seeds of fascism, they don't understand that America is not and never has been a meritocracy, and affirmative action is something that works to bring us towards that. Because fascism is quite literally in the seeds of Western society. Quite literally, colonialism created the standard of races in order to say that one race was superior to another. And those realities still exist today. When you look at those marginalized and minority groups, the fact that they don't have as much wealth, education, land, equity, safety as those majority groups is deeply rooted in the fact that America historically has not been a meritocracy. It is not a meritocracy. And until those wounds of fascism can be addressed, things like affirmative action must be there to right history's wrongs. But you can't really just dial down fascism to happening on an individual basis over the process of 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. No, you must go back to the roots of fascism and how it is deeply ingrained in everything we do in Western society as a large, in centuries and millennia of damage. And in order to look at that, you can look at the way that fascism has affected poor whites in America in 3 different areas. It's affected poor whites and people as a whole in America negatively across many different areas. But you can start a foundation by looking at 3 different areas, and that is healthcare, gun reform, and education. So poor whites, as a majority, will look at these platforms like Newsmax or Fox News that incite anger and fear, constantly feeding propaganda that have the seeds and have sowed the seeds in fascism. And poor whites will think, well, I was told that with my skin color, I would have access and the keys to all of the luxuries that life can afford me, to good health, to education, to good jobs, to safety. But that is not the reality, and why it is because racism, sexism, homophobia, bigotry is still alive today in America, a place that we must continue to advocate to be a democracy for all united under God. But in terms of healthcare, to look at how fascism weaves and sews the threads, you will look at healthcare. Those poor whites who are frustrated, who are angry, and who people from marginalized and minority groups will hate me saying that, but who could, for all intents and purposes, be perfectly fine people, be perfectly good people at heart, but they have been slowly been sowed with the seeds of fascism. They will look at their life, and they may be sick, they may be physically ill, but they look at the television, they look at these platforms, they look at these individuals, they look at these institutions, and those institutions say, this Affordable Health Care Act is a affront to democracy. This is a bastardization of freedom. We cannot tolerate, and we must eviscerate at all costs accessible and affordable health care, because this puts this majority group in danger. And this advantages these marginalized and minority groups, and they will eviscerate you because of this advantage. And so poor whites look at that. They're ill. They're sick. They need to go to the hospital. You look at the European Union. You look across the countries who are a little bit older, a little bit more seasoned, a little bit more established than the United States of America. One of the first biggest differences that you look at is the accessibility to healthcare. It does not matter what your race, your income level, your socioeconomic status is. Every person in most of the European Union is looked at as a person who has the right to be healthy. But you have in the United States these platforms, these individuals, these institutions who have told poor whites, you cannot support accessible and affordable health care. And so what happens? These people don't use accessible and affordable health care. They don't use Obamacare. That Obamacare is the enemy. And these people get sick. They get physically sick. They get physically ill. They don't go to the hospital. They don't go to treat conditions that they have. And then what happens? These people start to abuse drugs. They start to abuse opiates. And we all know that when you have physical illness, when you don't feel well in your physical self, that can manifest into spiritual and mental illness. And before you know it, you are sitting, you've been rallied up and pumped up with fear and anger and hate, and you're sick, you're unhealthy. And all you can do is continue to be more fearful, more angry. Fascism has sowed the seeds into those poor whites, and they're angry and they're unhealthy, they're sick. And they're rightfully angry. The problem is that those institutions, those platforms, those individuals who told those poor whites that you cannot support this affordable, this accessible healthcare by any means, they were not saying that for poor whites, to protect the interests of poor whites, to protect the interests of blacks, to protect the interests of Latinos, of anyone, which everyone should be able to access healthcare that is affordable, that is reachable for them. Everyone should be able to do that. People should be able to take care of their own physical health. People should be able to take care of their children's physical health. But the poor whites don't understand that it was the seeds of fascism that swayed them to believe that accessible and affordable health care was not right for the American system. They were swayed by institutions and platforms and individuals, not because these entities care about any average American, no matter their skin color. They were swayed by these individuals and platforms and institutions because advocating for privatized healthcare, that is an ulterior motive. That is something that they are advocating for through nefarious means for their wealthy backers, their wealthy donors, their wealthy support groups who have absolutely no need to have accessible and affordable health care. But that is not the case for poor whites, for poor blacks, for middle class whites, middle class blacks, middle class Latinos, middle class poor whites, poor Asians, for any average American citizen. Those are the seeds of fascism, again, that says this majority group holds value over this minority group. And these poor whites were swayed. These poor whites were vulnerable and they were betrayed. And then what do? They turn to opiates in order to coddle and tame their anxieties and fears about their growing diminishing of health, their health that's diminishing, to coddle the fears about their safety. Because when they look on television, they see on a loop at these platforms, when they look at these platforms and these individuals and these institutions talking about criminality in the United States, they see on a loop these people from this marginalized or minority group, these others. They are a threat to your safety. They are a threat to your health. And these platforms, these institutions, they tell you, well, what you need to do is you need to go get some guns. You need to go get some guns to protect you and your family, to protect you. These weapons are a part of your right as an American citizen. The seeds of fascism, these platforms, these propaganda platforms and individuals and institutions say, you as a majority, this is a part of your constitutional right. But little to the knowledge of these poor whites who go and stockpile their pistols and their AR-15s and their shotguns and their knives. Little to their knowledge, their health has been declining. Their physical and mental health has been declining. And all the while, they've been buying this propaganda that is coming from these institutions and these platforms and these individuals for nefarious means with ulterior motives that has no benefit to poor whites. And poor whites, they're continuing to lose their safety. They're continuing to lose their financial stability. They're continuing to lose their education. They're continuing to lose all of those threads that give them security in society. Yet they've done everything that these platforms have told them to do. They've stockpiled their guns. They've rejected affordable and accessible health care. But they still are not happy. They still are physically and mentally sick. And so when they get those guns, they're mentally and physically sick. And some of these people who have been swayed by the seeds of fascism will go out And they will try to eviscerate, insert name of those people from that minority or those marginalized groups. Some of those people will succeed in that. But the majority of those people will do nothing but end up turning those weapons on themselves. And so at this point, you have a full-blown crisis. You have a drug crisis among the majority group. You have an opioid crisis among the majority group. You have a suicide crisis among the majority group. And those poor whites say, I don't understand. I did everything that these platforms, these institutions, these individuals told me to do. And then those who are by any chance luckily still to be left, those of those poor whites who have been sowed, been radicalized by the seeds of fascism. And I emphasize the word radicalized. The only solution to end fascism is de-radicalization. We'll get back to that in a moment. But these people, after they failed to find the solace and the peace and that the well-being that they need from rejecting the undemocratic, affordable, and accessible healthcare, after they have not been able to afford the health and the well-being that they need by stockpiling guns or by taking pills, well, then the platforms and the institutions and the individuals that have upheld the seeds of fascism come back and they say, well, if you look at the educational system now, you look at who is teaching, who is on the board of education, who is in the government, who are the professors, you see more and more people of these marginalized and minority groups, and that is a threat to you as a majority group. And so you must eviscerate these people. Don't go to their universities. Don't go to their classes. Do not go to their museums. You don't need that. Do not seek out education. And so the poor whites do not seek out education. They do what these platforms and these institutions and these individuals that are rooted and planting the seeds of fascism tell them to do. And they reject education. At this point, I have to stop and tell you, when you stop learning, you stop living. I will repeat that again. When you stop learning, you stop living. And so you have poor whites who are sick because they are not subscribing to this undemocratic, accessible, and affordable health care. And they are having very, very dark thoughts because they have all these weapons in this house. And either they need to use it against somebody else or they need to use it against themselves. And then they have rejected education, but they still feel angry. They still feel fearful. They still feel like something is missing because the seeds of fascism has been sowed. And education, when you look at education, the fact that, I recently did a video where I talked about the fact that we need men at the table in education, men of all colors, men of all races, men of all socioeconomic statuses are rejecting education more and more and more. More boys and men are dropping out after middle school, after high school, and more than ever before, white men are not moving on to university because they have been told by those institutions and platforms and individuals that you should not go and take these undemocratic courses, get this undemocratic knowledge from these institutions that are being swayed and corrupted by these people from these marginalized and minority groups. And I'll repeat it again, when you stop learning, you stop living. Knowledge is power, and this whole life that we have on this planet is a life lesson. This whole life that we have on this planet is a course, is a module, is a class. It is a lesson. this whole life, the moment you stop learning, your cup will never, ever be full. It will always be empty. And yet, these poor whites have done what these platforms and these institutions told them to do, and they are still not happy. They told them not to go to these institutions, these universities, these schools where those marginalized and minority groups are corrupting you, corrupting your children. They told them not to go to the museums. Don't fill yourself with knowledge. But somehow, poor whites are still unhappy. They are still taking their own lives more. They are still facing opioid crises. And the roots of trying to keep people, no matter what color they are, out of education that is affordable and accessible for everyone, not only affects people of color people of color in marginalized groups, Black people, women, LGBTQ people, who have been chained down by those chains, who have been cogged down by those chains of fascism for millennia, for centuries, for decades. It not only hurts them, it hurts those poor whites as well. And then those platforms, those institutions, those individuals who told poor whites, don't go and get an education from those people. It was never ever about the interests of the poor whites or the poor Blacks or any average American citizen. It was always about those institutions and platforms and individuals, lobbyists, and their support groups and their wealthy donors. It was never ever about the American people. And so you have these roots of fascism that come deeply, deeply from, as Madiba said, as Nelson Mandela said, from those roots of war and colonization and slavery and sexism. And we don't understand where we are today. It must be a difficult life. It must be a difficult life, whether you believe in an afterlife or not. I personally do. I personally believe that what I do in this life, God will judge me for it. And by God, if I do not show my sisters and brothers the compassion and love that they deserve, whether they're my enemy or not, I will feel the wrath of God. I will feel that hurt inside of me. And whether you believe in God or not, it must be some life to live. Whether you believe in an afterlife or not, when you get to that old rickety age and you look back at your life and it was full of hate and anger and violence and illness and sickness, when you could have done something about it, when you could have embraced your sisters and brothers of all races, all backgrounds, all socioeconomic classes with unity, one nation under God, when you could have done that, but you look back at your life and it was full with anger and hate and violence. I think, what a life is that to live? You might not believe in an afterlife like me, but when you get to that rickety old age and you were close to taking your last breaths, it must be incredibly difficult to look back at your life and realize that it was not one filled with love and unity and brotherhood and peace. Fascism hurts poor whites just as much as it hurts every other average American citizen. And that hurt reverberates across history, across time. Now, we said Germany has poured money into anti-fascist initiatives because they know it is ingrained in Western civilization. It is ingrained in everything that we do. And so it must be something that is continually revisited, that is continually addressed and redressed. As Mandiba said, America must embrace the same thing. Now, what I will say to you, you probably won't like, but we must love our enemies. And we gotta talk about race a little bit longer, because I know it hurts. I know it's painful. It brings up wounds of the past, and we don't want to think about it. But until one recognizes that America was never a meritocracy, it can never be a meritocracy. So we're going to have to talk about race a little bit more. It makes you uncomfortable, but we're going to have to talk about it a little bit more. The government, people, America as a democracy, as a society as a whole, has a duty to continue to de-radicalize those who have been sown with the seeds of fascism. America will have to continue to de-radicalize those who have been sown with the seeds of fascism. And it's not easy and it's costly, but I guarantee you in the end, it will save so many more lives. It will save democracy that we are all working towards. It will create that meritocracy that we are all working towards. That starts with a few things, and it has to be something that America does continuously on an individual and on a systemic level. The government will have to pour money into this, but the lives and the money that it will save as a result is priceless. It's priceless. It will start with education. The minute you stop learning, you stop living. People need to be educated on the dangers of fascism, how it is the ultimate threat to democracy, the ultimate inverse of democracy, how it must be pulled up from its roots like weeds continually every time it stems up. Education is at the cusp of ascension. Those who were educated are shown to be more involved in their communities, to donate to charity more, to deal less with mental illness and anxiety, to have less suicidal thoughts. Those institutions and platforms and individuals that have told you that you don't need education from those people don't care about your community and your mental health and your physical health and charity and your thoughts. Education must continuously be attained, pursued, acquired by all people, accessible by all people in America, no matter their race, their status, their socioeconomic background, their sex, their gender, their identity, their ideology, their belief. Education must be used continuously on an individual level and on a governmental level to combat the virus that is fascism, the ultimate threat to democracy. And next, it has to be advocacy. There must be advocacy on the individual level, all the way up to the governmental level, to fight for the fact that every American, no matter their race, whether they're white, Latino, Asian, Indian, Native American, Alaskan, Hawaiian, Polynesian, it doesn't matter. Whatever your background is, however much money you or your parents or your grandparents had, wherever in the United States of America that you live, advocacy must be a part of every individual and every governmental pursuit. One nation under God. We must continue to advocate for democracy for one and for all. Because a democracy that benefits one people, one group, one ideology is not a democracy at all. Advocacy must continually be reinforced to combat fascism on an individual level and on a governmental level. And lastly, we must strive for sisterhood and brotherhood, a unity of all men, of every race, of every color in the United States of America. Every person of every race has a duty to love their enemy. White people must love black people. Black people must love white people. Hispanic people must love Asian people. Asian people must love Native American people. It is the only way it will work. One nation, indivisible, under God. We must be united together. We must come from a place of love and unity and brotherhood. We're gonna have to talk about race a little bit more. It makes people uncomfortable. But in order to reach that place where we truly can call America a democracy, a meritocracy, we're gonna have to talk about race. Fascism must continually, through these facets, be uprooted every time it stems its head on an individual level and on a governmental level. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad God brought you to me, and I'm so glad God brought me to you.